Today we'll be exploring the Metrics Export Endpoint that's available in Cockroach Cloud. Metrics allow you to visualize the internals of your system and make informed decisions as to how to adapt them given real-time information. With CockroachDB's Metrics Export Endpoint, you can bring CockroachDB metrics into your own observability platform, as if you were running CockroachDB yourself. And this gives you visibility into your whole stack, right back to the database. The Metrics Export Endpoint can export metrics to AWS Cloudwatch, Azure Monitor, Datadog, and what we'll be looking at today, Prometheus. I'll source some environment variables, and I'll create a cluster. I'll copy my cluster ID and the host. I'll generate a password and I'll source those environment variables. Let's check on the status of the cluster. So that's now created. And with that created, I'll create a user that I'll use to connect to the cluster. With the user created, I'll connect to the cluster. I'll create a table to store product information. And I'll insert 1,000 products into that table. Now I'm running an application that will select from, insert into, update and delete from that table. And with everything set up, I'll enable the Metrics Export Endpoint. This is a simple post request to this endpoint with my cluster ID in the URL path, and it takes the API key that I generated in the UI. If you're curious, that can be done here. So access management, service accounts, create a user, and then you set up your API key there. So I'll enable that now for Prometheus. And I can check on the status of that. It will say enabling for a couple of seconds and then it will be enabled. So that's now enabled. I'll now head over to the UI and grant a service account access to scrape metrics for that cluster. I've already created a service account called Metrics Scraper, which is just an organization member. It has no other permissions than that. I'll edit its roles and I'll give it Metrics Demo. That's the name of my new cluster. Cluster operator access, which is the lowest level access, but it is enough to allow for metric scraping. With those permissions granted, let's head back over to the console and test the scrape endpoint. Note that for a multi-region cluster, you'll get a separate scrape endpoint for each of those regions. My metrics are being generated. With that up and running, I'll start a local Docker environment with Prometheus and Grafana to show you what those metrics actually look like. I have 2 files to configure Prometheus. One template file that's safe for me to check into source control and another secret one. I'll show you what the safe one looks like. This just has a placeholder for the metric scrape endpoint and a placeholder for the credentials. I wrote a tool called setconfig a while back and I'll be using that to take the secret information that I have in my environment and apply it to that secret file. Now I'll spin up Prometheus and Grafana. And with those up and running, I can now visit the Prometheus console and check the status of my scrape target. That's all up and running and healthy. And I've got access to all of the metrics available here. For example, Cloud SQL connections. If I execute that, we can see that there are currently 4 connections to the cluster. I'll connect to Prometheus. I'm using the host name of my Docker container. And that's successful. And now I'll import a dashboard that I've pre-prepared. And those are my metrics. The 4 connections that we saw earlier. I'm currently making around 22 queries per second to the cluster. I'm storing nearly 8 megabytes of data. The latency, we can see the 99.9th percentile is currently around 28 milliseconds, with the 99th percentile being around 13 milliseconds. And we can also see that I'm making around 10 selects per second, 5 inserts per second, and around 3 updates and deletes per second, which is in line with the application that I'm running. Whether you're using AWS Cloudwatch, Azure Monitor, Datadog, or Prometheus, CockroachDB's Metrics Export Endpoint allows you to lift the hood on CockroachDB, meaning you're never second guessing your cluster.